The year is 1492. It is a monumental year for the Spanish crown and the history of the world. At the court of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, a group of Jewish officials are making desperate pleas for the fates of their people. Their aim is to stop the sovereigns from enacting one of the most consequential rulings of their reign, the expulsion of the Jews from the Spanish kingdom. There is no need for this extremity, the courtiers argue with an eloquent tongue. They have served the monarchs faithfully and would only continue to do so. The Jewish people are honest and hard-working, bringing plentiful revenue to the crown. What's more, the officials vow that Spanish Jews will further lessen all contact with their Catholic brethren and confine themselves to their historic ghettos. In a show of allegiance to the Christian cause, they offer the enticing sum of 30,000 ducats for the crown's struggle against the Muslims. At this, King Ferdinand of Aragon begins to waver. The Jews had served him well, providing a steady and ample source of revenue during trying times, and the royal coffers were nearly depleted. He calculates that he could always banish the Jews once the Muslims are no longer a threat. But in that instance, a man enters the room. Here he is, as imagined by historian Rafael Sabatini. You behold him pale, a little breathless in the excitement and anger by which he is possessed. His deep-set eyes glow somberly with the fever of fanatical zeal and indignation. He draws his lean old frame erect. In his shriveled, sinewy old hands, he flaunts aloft a crucifix. The man has heard the Jews' offer. The financial sum is unfortunately reminiscent of another. "Judas," he cries, "once sold the Son of God for 30 pieces. Your Highnesses think to sell him again for 30,000. Here you have him. Sell him then, but acquit me of all share in this transaction." And crashing the crucifix upon the table before their startled Highnesses, he abruptly leaves the chamber. This man is Tomás de Torquemada. He is Grand Inquisitor over the tribunal of the Holy Office of the Inquisition. In other words, he is the first face of the Spanish Inquisition. Now, this anecdote is likely pure BS, historical fiction. Nonetheless, it encapsulates the mind, the fervor, the resolve of one man who committed himself to the destruction of what he regarded as the great sickness of his homeland, heresy. Most prominently in the form of the Jews and their apostate descendants, conversos. Torquemada. It's a name that has long sent shivers down the spines of many a mortal, heretics and faithfuls alike. The name itself is grim beyond belief. From the joining of torque, the Latin word for twist, and quemada, Spanish for burnt, there is perhaps no other historical villain whose actual name better suits his terrifying legacy. A legacy synonymous with religious fanaticism, oppression and terror, and some of the gravest moral crimes committed in the name of God. But, ladies and gentlemen, what was this immensely powerful friar actually like? What manner of a man was he? And does he deserve his terrible reputation? Short bio, ladies and gentlemen. Born in 1420 in Valladolid, or in the nearby village of Torquemada, Tomás hailed from a wealthy landowning family. His uncle Juan was in fact a decorated and highly prestigious cardinal, not to mention one of the most influential theologians of the late Middle Ages. It was likely under his influence that, at a very young age, little Tomás entered the local Dominican monastery of St. Paul in Valladolid, a monastery his uncle had commissioned. It's long been stated as fact that the Torquemadas were of Jewish descent, an interesting talking point for psychohistory, but then recent studies have found no evidence to support this. The young Tomás proved an excellent and enthusiastic scholar, devoting himself to monastic life and the pursuit of learning for most of his adolescence and early adulthood. Flash forward to 1452, and Tomás, 32 years of age, was appointed as prior at the monastery of Santa Cruz in Segovia, a post for which he was continually re-elected. Having acquired a reputation for his wisdom, his piety, and his good judgment, he was introduced to Princess Isabella I of Castile by her mother. Eventually, and reluctantly, He became the personal confessor to the future queen, and then to her husband, King Ferdinand II of Aragon, whom Isabella married in 1469. The year marks the union of the crowns of Castile and Aragon, often cited as the birth of modern Spain. Now, one of the greatest sources of social tension in 15th century Spain was a class of people known as conversos. They're also known to history as New Christians and Crypto-Jews. Now, these were baptized Christians, either from the conversion of recent Jewish ancestors or their own conversion to Roman Catholicism during their lifetime. Contrary to popular belief both now and then, the vast majority of these people embraced the Christian gospel, while many of their Jewish ancestors had, in the previous century, converted out of fear and had remained Catholics by coercion or convenience. Their descendants had settled into their new faith, accepting the teachings of Christ. Some even consider themselves to be more Christian than old Christians, since as Jews they were related by blood to Christ himself. At the same time, though, they took great pride in their heritage, observing Jewish rites and customs. The conversos had risen to prominence among the kingdom's social and economic elite. As such, they were a great source of envy and mistrust for many Spaniards, who were suspicious of their wealth and standing, but also of their patriotism and of their genuine commitment to the true faith. The medieval history of the Iberian Peninsula is checkered with attacks on Jews, anti-Semitic riots, and cases of blood libel. And this was no different in 15th century Spain, now targeting conversos as well. Conspiracy theories abounded about a fifth column of conversos poisoning the social fabric of Spain and the Catholic Church from within. As divisions grew, so too did the need for decisive measures to restore order. With the union of Castile and Aragon and the Christian reconquest after centuries of disputed rule in the Iberian Peninsula, there was a real thirst for cultural, political, and religious homogeneity. So, in 1478, the Catholic monarchs petitioned Pope Sixtus IV, requesting permission for an inquisitorial tribunal in the Spanish kingdom. Inquisitions, from the Latin inquisitio or inquiry, had roots in the episcopal and papal tribunals of the Middle Ages, courts set up in southern France and northern Italy to investigate, i.e. inquire, into and prosecute religious sects suspected of deviation from the Roman Catholic Church. In 1480, after 2 years of testing softer strategies like mandatory catechism for conversos, the Spanish Inquisition was finally launched by the Catholic monarchs. Torquemada, not yet an inquisitor, had been a loud voice pushing for its implementation. The Inquisition began in Seville, a hotbed for Jews and conversos. Appointed inquisitors were sent to the Andalusian city to collect confessions and accusations of heresy from members of the community. These were filtered, cases considered genuine were examined and brought to trial by a jury of lawmen and scholars before a sentence for each was imposed. This could range from pardons and reconciliation to the church after fines, confiscation of property, and a humiliating procession in a public ceremony called an auto de fe, to the more terminal public executions, including burning at the stake or the garrote. Torture was unhappily used to extract confessions. The three main ones included torture by the rack, torture of the hoist, and an early form of waterboiling. Now, the Spanish Inquisition was ferocious in its early years. Nobody had expected the sheer number of accusations pouring in once the Holy Office was up and running. Decades of pent-up hatred and resentment exploded onto the scene as enemies of the conversos exploited the tribunals to settle scores or win an advantage. Think inheritance disputes, business competitors, neighborhood vendettas, and people would accuse others just so they wouldn't get accused first. The Inquisition's ranks ballooned just to keep up with the volumes, and with the enlarged capacity, it spread through all corners of the kingdom like wildfire. Confiscations brought much-needed revenue into the royal coffers. Within a matter of years, the Inquisition had spread to nearly a dozen cities across the kingdom. In 1483, the monarchs vested full powers of the Holy Office in the person of Torquemada. He had been one of 8 inquisitors appointed by the Pope the previous year. Trusting Torquemada's character and judgment, the Pope agreed to the special appointment amid frayed relations with the monarchs over control of the Inquisition and, as the Pope saw it, its corrupt, spiraling direction. The following year, in 1484, Torquemada introduced what's known as his instructions, something of a rules manual for inquisitors, including 28 articles on the legal procedures and structures of the Holy Office. More on this later. The man was a ruthless and highly energetic administrator, bent on extirpating religious deviance in all forms, particularly the heresy of conversos, but also sodomy, usury, blasphemy, polygamy, the list goes on. Through the scope of the Inquisition, Torquemada became one of the most powerful figures in the kingdom, as the personal confessor to the monarchs, but also having recently been appointed to the royal council, his influence at court was unmatched. His handling of the Inquisition was met with serious opposition from the Pope, a running theme of Torquemada's reign. Both he and the monarchs were openly defiant of the Pope's will, condemning his critiques of the Holy Office, as well as the thousands of pardons he granted to accused heretics who fled to Rome seeking appeals. While the Inquisition raged, in 1490 it was discovered that a group of Jews and conversos had tortured and crucified a young Spanish boy now known to history as the Holy Child of La Guardia. Torquemada pounced on the case, spreading its details far and wide to hammer home the kingdom's Jewish problem and the necessity of the Inquisition. Riots broke out across the kingdom. Despite the case's shaky foundations, notably the fact that no corpse was ever found, it appeared to confirm centuries-old accusations of ritual murder of Spanish Christians by the Jews. In March 1492, under pressure from the High Inquisitor, the monarchs ordered the expulsion of all Jews from the kingdom, hoping to solve Spain's converso problem by severing conversos from their corrupting source. About half of Spain's Jews converted to Christianity, retaining their livelihoods and property. The rest left the kingdom within 4 months. Years later, many would return to family and kin and ultimately convert. Reports of Torquemada's tyrannical reign of terror continued to pour into Rome. Pope Alexander decided to take measures into his own hands. Deposing Torquemada would mean fracturing much-needed cooperation with the Spanish monarchs, who valued Torquemada and his work too much. So the Pope suggested, in June 1494, to appoint 4 other High Inquisitors, cautiously named assistants, to share the duties of Torquemada, citing old age and failing health. The powers of the old autocrat were thereby diluted. The following year, in 1495, Torquemada left the royal court after a decade of close counsel to the sovereigns and near supreme power in the affairs of the Inquisition. Crippled with gout, he retired to his cherished monastery at Avila, allegedly built over a Jewish cemetery. Though he was counterbalanced by 2 other High Inquisitors, Torquemada remained the guiding spirit and supreme arbiter behind the Inquisition. It was at Avila in May 1498 that he published his 4th and final set of instructions, nominally to soften some of the measures of his previous instructions. Torquemada died peacefully in September of that same year, aged 77. He was later succeeded by Francisco Jiménez de Cisneros, a key figure in Spanish history who would combat the influence of Islam with the same fervor Torquemada had directed at that of the Jews. Torquemada's institution would outlive him by over 300 years. It's an institution which, much like its chief designer, has long been shrouded in what's known as the Black Legend, generation upon generation of damaging propaganda spread by Spain's enemies, especially Protestant countries, at a time when Spain was the world's dominant power and empire. Western thinkers and writers active during the Enlightenment later built upon the exaggerated bad press, depicting Spain as a land of barbarism and intolerance. To this, fellow viewers, I say it's a whole lot of talk, but not enough matter. So, time for a deeper look at the man and his controversial legacy. Torquemada was an ascetic in the most committed possible sense. As noted, he descended from a wealthy family. His uncle was one of the most consequential and respected European theologians of his age, a cardinal with great influence both in the Kingdom of Castile as well as in Rome. Now, did Torquemada, in his younger days, wish for himself the sort of influence his uncle had? This we'll never know, but if he ever did, it seems he contented himself with the simple life of a monk, spending his years in the classroom, the cloister, the sacristy, and the confessional. This monastic lifestyle he pursued well into his 50s, a lifetime for many of his day, reaching the position of prior at the convent of Santa Cruz in Segovia, midway between Madrid and the city of Valladolid. He gained a reputation for his piety and strictness, a reputation which, by all accounts, is well-deserved. God and the Catholic Church came before all else. He famously refused to pay his sister's dowry, leaving her no choice but to join the local convent and live out the rest of her days as a nun. He commanded great respect from his Dominican brothers. As a man of great learning and faith, all could see he had the talent and mind to follow in his uncle's footsteps. Nonetheless, he chose to commit himself to the service of his brethren and his fellow Castilians. And this respect was earned, not just for his strict observance of God's writ, which he taught and expected from others, but equally from the deprivations he imposed on himself. He was known for being stricter on himself than on the monks he led. He never ate meat, he slept on a wooden board without bedding, and he never wore linen. We're told he initially declined the post of personal confessor to Queen Isabella, but that he eventually succumbed under her insistence. She was usually one to get her own way. Before long, he was also royal confessor to her husband, King Ferdinand. The high esteem in which they held him for his counsel and wisdom never really waned. When in 1497 the royal couple's son passed away at the tender age of 19, he was buried in Torquemada's monastery in Avila. Again, a telltale sign of the monarch's trust and reverence towards the old friar decades on. Isabella was especially pious, and she saw Torquemada not just as a confessor, but as a confidant in religious matters more generally. He'd go on to refuse all sorts of dignities, including the Archbishopric of Seville. In his instructions to the tribunals of the Holy Office, a series of edicts on inquisitorial procedure, he expressly forbade officers of the Inquisition from accepting gifts from prisoners under pain of excommunication or dismissal, as well as repayment doubled in value of what they'd received. The order was repeated in a later edict too, demonstrating a firm hand against ongoing bribery. He was always sensitive to the corrupting power of gold and would routinely outline sanctions for abuses in his edicts. Contrary to popular imagination, the tribunals were often virtually bankrupt. Wages were modest, and officers were forbidden from holding two salaries at once. Revenue earned from confiscation of property went into the royal coffers or into the maintenance of the overstretched and destitute Holy Office. In short, Torquemada managed the Inquisition's internal affairs with the same rigidity with which he ran his convent, expecting total integrity and humility in the service of God. A long-held myth states that when Torquemada was Grand Inquisitor, he would frequently travel with a retinue of 250 armed footmen and 50 cavalry. The source for this is abundantly shaky. It's more likely that Queen Isabella insisted he be accompanied by a bodyguard after rumoured or even attempted assassinations on his life. A man as pious as Torquemada was more likely to have been relatively unfazed by assassination threats, embracing the idea of martyrdom in his devotion to God. He spent virtually all his money on the church, lavishly funding the Dominican convent in Segovia, as well as the church in his native Torquemada, among other public works. He was, after all, a lover of architecture, close to his heart was the convent of St. Thomas in Avila. He oversaw its construction and furnishing, pouring the majority of his earnings from the early 1480s right up to his death. The monastery became his chief residence and something akin to his own tribunal. There he withdrew for retirement, returning to a life familiar to him as a brother of the Dominican order, but with the wide-ranging and enormous responsibilities accrued from his role as a Grand Inquisitor. It's frequently said that he would happily have gone on to live the life of a simple monk, had it not been for the Inquisition. This is an interesting theory, if not for one detail. This was the man who played the biggest part in devising and laying the groundwork for the Spanish Inquisition, one of the most feared and consequential legal systems of the medieval and early modern periods. This was no simple monk. The Spanish Inquisition is often seen as some frenzied clampdown on Spanish Jews by a band of rabid Catholic fanatics running amok. And this is misleading for several reasons. Yes, it was an institution which inspired great terror. It was far more extensive and bloodier, well, ashier than previous inquisitions elsewhere in Europe. And yes, by modern Western standards, it would be considered a travesty of a legal system. Grossly unfair, cruel, arbitrary, biased, and fanatical. But then we're not talking about the modern era. We're talking about a brutal age, where the concept of human rights was essentially non-existent, and an age in which religion underpinned the lives of all. It was science, philosophy, a source of universal truth, all wrapped up in one. Faith in the Holy Trinity, according to Catholic dogma, and the honest repentance of sin ensured safe passage to heaven in the afterlife. Heresy, then, was a massive problem, and the genuine issue of the conversos had been on the rise since the late 1300s. The heretic, by undermining the true faith, presented a danger not only to themselves, but to their families and to other members of society. They endangered the salvation of their souls, but also the souls of others. Very few Christians of sound mind would have disagreed with the need for reform in the peninsula, given the existential problem posed by the conversos, as well as the real societal tensions they produce with old Christians through their numbers and influence. That the motivations of the Inquisition were not radical for the time is suggested by the simple fact that the Inquisition was set up by a papal bull. And besides these contextual justifications, the Inquisition was in fact pretty sophisticated for the time. Contrary to popular belief, it was an elaborate legal system with clear-cut procedures and administrative hierarchies, rules and regulations, codes of conduct, clearly defined roles, and a vast web of checks and balances. It involved the gathering and careful scrutiny of evidence before sentencing by officials who were highly well-read in theology, administration, law, and philosophy. Now, why am I saying this? In the absence of much personal information on Torquemada, we have to look at his work. The sophistication of the Spanish Inquisition relative to other legal systems is to a large degree attributable to the years of work put into it by its first High Inquisitor. Now, he wasn't alone in founding or directing the Inquisition. In fact, he wasn't even the one who initiated it, that person being the Cardinal of Seville, Cardinal Mendoza. But his contribution was certainly the largest. His dictates for the rules and procedures of the Holy Office, known as his instructions, formed the bedrock of the institution. And in the words of historian Rafael Sabatini, who was hardly a fan of Torquemada, the instructions, quote, may be said to have given the jurisprudence of the Spanish Inquisition a settled form, which continued practically unchanged for over 300 years after Torquemada's death. With a methodical, legalistic mind and phenomenal amounts of energy, he infused it with a great deal of order and structure, the alternatives to which were the far more barbarous procedures of secular law and mob rule. To give a few examples, torture, which was the norm for the day, by the way, had been for centuries and would remain so centuries after, was unauthorized before a certain point in the judicial process and was usually used to iron out contradictions in statements. It could not be applied without the approval of the prosecutor, the bishop of the diocese, or even the Supreme Council, right at the top of the pyramid, over which Torquemada himself presided. Once this was approved, the accused had to be examined by physicians to ensure they were physically fit to be tortured. Fancy that. And a doctor needed to be present in the room for the duration of the session. At his command, the torture had to be stopped. Each torture session was limited to a maximum of 15 minutes. In only about 1% of the cases was torture applied twice, and never for a third time. It's facts like these which have led a great deal of historians to state that Torquemada's Inquisition was in fact relatively enlightened for the time. The fact that he attempted, to the greatest possible degree, to curb abuses of power, unnecessary violence, suffering and death, insofar as it didn't conflict with his religious convictions or the goals of the Inquisition, shouldn't be overlooked. And we see this in many of his official instructions surrounding torture and capital punishment, for instance, but also matters of due diligence. Regarding executions, the accused were only burned alive at the stake after a systematized procedure involving hearings, interrogations, which didn't necessarily involve torture, and opportunities at various stages of the inquisitorial process to be reconciled with the church. Death by burning at the stake while alive was for those who'd proven unrepentant until the very end. Earlier confessions could result in more lenient sentences. Confessions during the interrogation could result in fines, loss of property, imprisonment, etc. Confession during the auto de fe, for example, so at the last possible moment, could result in being garroted at the stake instead of being burned alive. At this point, you might be wondering about the death toll during Torquemada's reign. The first few years of the Inquisition were indeed the deadliest and the strictest in its near 3.5 centuries of existence. 50 to 60% of those convicted in this period were burned at the stake. It's pretty safe to say this period includes the greatest concentration of cases with sentences we can describe as unfair, even by the standards of the day. Sentences which justifiably led to violent unrest in major cities, official complaints from fleeing conversos, and serious concern from the Pope and his court. This is in large part why Torquemada has been so condemned, far more than his successors. It's estimated that between 1,000 and 1,500 people were killed during Torquemada's time as High Inquisitor. Terrible, yes, and these deaths were horrific. Be that as it may, and I am no apologist for the Inquisition, the figure pales next to the estimates which have been circulating for centuries by critics of the Inquisition. It also pales next to figures of witch burnings and other frenzied persecutions of the day, and even centuries after, occurring elsewhere in Europe. As stated before, the exaggerated bad press of the Spanish Inquisition to this day is largely the continuation of demonizing propaganda from rival Protestant powers like Britain, Northern Germany, and the Netherlands. These were Spain's inferiors in power and wealth, but with a lethal and skillfully harnessed weapon at their disposal, the printing press. So yes, the Inquisition wasn't exactly a time for cheer, but nor was it about a rabid horde of anti-Semitic sadists bursting into towns and burning all the Jews and conversos they could lay their hands on. Torquemada was not a mad monk, nor was he some bloodthirsty brute. The system he devised was in many ways like him, organized, thorough, and deeply austere in its aims and methods. Was Torquemada a fanatic? Well, if he was a fanatic, then so was the general mass of Spanish Catholics. Torquemada's views were hardly unique for the time. Again, it's important to put ourselves in the mind of a 15th century holy man. Faith was everything. Conversely, heresy poisoned everything. If somebody committed heresy unknowingly, he could be reconciled to the church. He was simply seen as a lost sheep who'd been temporarily led astray. But if he did so knowingly and postured as a good Catholic, he needed to be punished, killed in bodily form to remove their influence from the earthly realm, and sent to paradise if repentant, or killed and banished to hell if stubbornly unrepentant. This is where the Inquisition came in, and where an unbending, incorruptible will like Torquemada's was seen as a good thing by many. Heresy needed to be stamped out with the same seriousness that its dangers posed. A deeply pious man like him would have invested himself heart and soul in what he would have conceived as a divine mission on earth. Of course, a key issue with the Inquisition is that the bulk of the convicted conversos were likely faithful Catholics. They were just culturally Jewish in many ways. This distinction was not made in an era of little to no tolerance for other faiths besides one's own, even so much as cultural traces. Likewise, in an era and among people marked by centuries-old hostility towards Jews, and in a legal climate where guilt was presumed before innocence. As for Torquemada's administrative talents, well, he managed to spread the Inquisition from a single court in Seville to 24 courts all across Spain in the span of 15 years. Once he was appointed as High Inquisitor, he got to work immediately and would never really stop. He directed the Inquisition, fulfilling all the day-to-day duties as head of the Holy Office's Supreme Council, and was personally involved in major cases he took a particular interest in. Besides playing the largest role in devising the legal framework, he would continually refine it over the years, curbing abuses, addressing problems that had been completely or partly overlooked in the original instructions. As a royal councillor, he advised the monarchs on the kingdom's ecclesiastical affairs and royal relations with the papacy. In short, Torquemada was a reformer. The premises and motivations of the reform were generally accepted by Spanish Catholics. However, it was Torquemada's methods and the terror that his institution inspired which garnered him many critics. Since we've established that Torquemada's views weren't really uncommon for the time, and that the Inquisition in theory was hardly anything radical, the question is, was he crueler than the average holy man of his day? Well, he was certainly hawkish. He got the job done, but the extent of his strictness should be discussed. Take auto de fe's, from the Portuguese phrase acts of faith. In these solemn ceremonies, penitents were made to walk in long processions before Mass, sermon, and their sentencings were heard. To maximize the humiliation of the penitents, Torquemada insisted that the famous San Benito garb, that is, a yellow sackcloth, be worn by the penitents. This had actually been going out of fashion for public penance, but it was Torquemada who revived it. In his relentless efforts to leave no stone unturned, he extended the Inquisition as far and wide as possible. There wasn't really a category of society that was safe. This was in line with the Catholic teaching that all men are judged equally in the eyes of God, regardless of wealth or status. If you demonstrated heresy of any kind, you would be sniffed out and caught, such that noblemen, wealthy landowners, and even priests were mercilessly hounded once they were on the Inquisition's radar. Torquemada can perhaps be likened to a dog who, after sinking its fangs into its prey, cannot let go. It's actually reminiscent of an old pun on the Dominican order, nicknamed the Hounds of the Lord for their loyalty and servitude. Translate that into Latin, you've got Dominicanis. Extreme cases of this doggedness were measures for dead people. Now, people were often tried in absentia, say if they fled their sentence, by having their effigy burnt in autos de fe. They would be condemned to hell despite being physically absent. But a special procedure was reserved for the dead. Yes, even in death, you could still be prosecuted. Children and grandchildren were encouraged to come forward and denounce their dead ancestors of heresy if they had anything to confess. The idea was that sin was inheritable. So even if you were a squeaky clean, God-fearing Catholic, you could still be condemned for the alleged sins of your dead ancestors. You would lose the family estate, get barred from holding public office, or any prestigious job for that matter, and essentially become a social outcast. And you might think these would have disincentivized people from denouncing their ancestors, as if the idea of having them disinterred and burnt wasn't tragic enough. But people did it nonetheless, as keeping silent and getting caught carried much graver punishments than confessing to the crimes of your ancestors. And in the frenzied climate of the Inquisition's early days, you never knew who could denounce you. And this is one of the great moral charges against the Spanish Inquisition, the fact that anyone could denounce anyone. Yes, the accusations and accusers were vetted, but the accusations created an atmosphere of complete terror, akin to the denouncements in Nazi-occupied Europe or in Stalin's Soviet Union. Children turned on their parents, servants on their masters, neighbors on their friends, whether to avenge some kind of grievance, gain an unfair advantage, or simply out of fear of being denounced first. Meanwhile, people would confess to minor offences committed years earlier at the risk of a heavy fine or social disgrace, just to prevent being tipped off by someone else and risking life imprisonment or death at the stake. These were the wheels upon which the Inquisition ran. Accusers remained anonymous. When the accused were brought to trial, the inquisitors deliberately withheld the identity of the accusers as well as the content of the accusations. The idea was to keep the offence vague in the hopes that they would confess to the crime they were being accused of. If this happened, they could be more sure the accusation was genuine and would then decide on the severity of the punishment. If the accused did not confess to the crime, the inquisitors would try and tease it out through interrogation. On paper, anonymity was granted to denouncers so that they could be protected from eventual reprisals from the accused. But then we should question this. In the eyes of the faith, revenge killing would have martyred the accuser, which was one of the highest possible honors in the eyes of God, meaning that the likeliest motivation, as Sabatini infers, was to eliminate any fears that accusers might have had in denouncing somebody, so that they could do so without any concerns of retaliation. This was what kept the Inquisition going in full swing, and it effectively made common people agents of the Church, allowing the Inquisition to spread like wildfire. Now, anti-Semitism was essentially the norm for Spanish Catholics. Biblically, they were responsible for deicide. Socially, they were hermetic and cultural aliens, always cause for suspicion. Financially, they were extremely successful, occupying key positions and a source of envy for many. It was widely believed that the Jews were involved in a conspiracy to undermine the Catholic Church as well as the Crown, an idea which, as you might expect, has been totally debunked by historians. But as a result, conversos were seen as the wolf in sheep's clothing, the enemy within, and Torquemada was most certainly of this view. In his virulent anti-Semitism, one can make the case that he himself violated the, in inverted commas, code of the Spanish Inquisition. Let me explain this. Contrary to popular belief, the Spanish Inquisition did not target Jews. It targeted Christians who were seen as having strayed from the flock, especially conversos. Since they were baptized and claimed to be followers of Jesus Christ, they had made themselves answerable to Catholic canon law. It was the duty of the Church to bring them back under the fold and abandon all remnants of their Jewish customs and faith. Jews, on the other hand, well, their very existence was heretical, but the Catholic Church accepted that it wasn't their flock, so it had no business prosecuting them. Now this is clear, I can demonstrate that Torquemada can be accused of overstepping the boundaries of his jurisdiction. In one of his instructions, he forced rabbis to report any conversos to the Holy Office. That is, any baptized Christian giving alms to the synagogue or in any way showing reversion to their ancestral faith. The withholding of any incriminating information was a capital offense. He also instructed rabbis to publish, in their own synagogues, an edict stipulating the excommunication of any Jew who withheld information on known conversos. As such, Jews were essentially forced into becoming secret agents of the Spanish Inquisition. Failing to do so would make them enemies of the Holy Office. Bear in mind that excommunication was a fate worse than death for Jews. Consider then the dilemma of a rabbi who discovers that one of his congregants or almsgivers was a baptized Christian. He now has two choices: risk excommunication and death by staying quiet, or denounce the converso, face the contempt of your congregants, and the heavy conscience of betraying a brother. It also appears Torquemada played an active role in whipping up anti-Semitic feeling across the country. Take the case of the Holy Child of La Guardia in 1490 to 1491 over the crucifixion and murder of a 4-year-old Christian boy by a group of conversos and Jews performing an act of dark magic. They were charged, among other crimes, with cutting out the boy's heart. The alleged intention was to burn the heart along with a consecrated wafer stolen from a local church, and with the ashes of the two, poison the country's rivers. The case is endlessly mysterious. No body was ever found, and even the child's existence is speculated. But the relatively consistent confessions of the ringleaders have led serious historians, including Sabatini, to conclude that despite the case's oddities, as well as the atmosphere of anti-Semitism which could have brought about a phony case, the mock crucifixion and murder of a child likely happened. The ringleaders were burnt at the stake. Critics of Torquemada have long suggested that the High Inquisitor helped fabricate the details of the case. This too is highly unlikely. What can be said, though, is he used the case opportunistically. He more than likely disseminated copies of the sentence across Spain to bolster popular animosity against Jews and conversos. He had long been pushing for the expulsion of Jews from the kingdom, judging that the converso problem would persist as long as Jews remained present, corrupting Christians and abetting conversos. And it was this case, and the unrest it provoked, which brought Isabella and Ferdinand to sign the expulsion edict, something which they had long been reluctant to doing on account of the wealth that the Jews generated, the monarch's previous reputation of religious tolerance, especially Isabella's, and the number of Jews in the royal court. Equally, Torquemada can be accused of arrogance. He sent scolding letters to the Pope, accusing him of meddling with the affairs of the Holy Office, to the point of saying that the Pope was being lied to by accused heretics who had fled to Rome seeking pardons and complaining about the spiraling direction of the Inquisition. The same arrogance is true for the monarchs, particularly King Ferdinand, but then Torquemada was not a head of state. He was presiding over an institution largely legitimized by papal authority, acting for the benefit of the Roman Catholic Church. Yet he would accuse its earthly leader, the Vicar of Christ, of being misled and lied to by crafty conversos, in itself an insult to the critical faculties of the Pope and his advisors, while also snubbing the right for the accused to appeal before the Pope and for the Pope to pardon them. In this vein, Sabatini wrote this on the man, quote, "Whatever the simplicity of Torquemada's life and whatever his personal humility, it would be idle to pretend that he was not imbued with the pride and arrogance of his office, swollen by the increase of power accorded him, until, in matters of the faith, he did not hesitate to dictate to the sovereigns themselves and to reproach them, almost to the point of menace, when they were slow to act as he dictated, whilst it was dangerous for any under-sovereign rank to come into conflict with the Grand Inquisitor." It's important now to stress a final point before we close this video. In Rome, the Pope was granting absolutions and lifting capital punishments in favor of fines. And yes, the Vatican was making dizzying amounts of money for this, but the Pope's consistent message was that God did not desire the death of the unrepentant, rather that he should live, so that he can eventually be converted. Torquemada's inquisitors, on the other hand, felt they were doing God's work by sentencing the unrepentant to the flames. What they were doing was committing the murder of the soul. So again, while the grounds of the Inquisition were in many ways valid and legitimate, and many of the legal procedures were moderate and many even laudable for the time period, Torquemada's sentencing was unnecessarily cruel even by the standards of the day. He was, in effect, more extreme than the Pope. In 1832, just 2 years before the Inquisition was disbanded, Torquemada's tomb was ransacked by revolutionaries. His bones were disinterred and burned, allegedly in a mock auto-da-fe. Talk about a cruel irony.